A sleek black car gets pulled over in the middle of a Lexington street. And the reason? Simply because the driver is a black woman named Jasmine Crockett. Within just 3 minutes, she's searched, dragged out of the vehicle, and a mysterious bag of white powder appears under her seat. What Lieutenant Frank Wallace doesn't know is this. The woman he's trying to frame is far from ordinary. But when the truth finally surfaces, who will be exposed and who will have the courage to speak up? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Lexington, Kentucky, basked in the orange hue of sunset. The upscale neighborhood looked quiet, too quiet. Lawns were trimmed, fences polished, windows shut tight like secrets. A patrol cruiser sat parked under a fading sycamore tree. Inside, Lieutenant Frank Wallace watched the road like a hawk. 20 years in, and all he saw now were threats. His jaw clenched, fingers tapping the steering wheel. Beside him, Rookie Officer Daniel stayed silent, eyes flicking between his notes and the world outside, unsure which one made less sense. The air inside the car was tense, heavy with something unspoken. Frank wasn't here to keep the peace. He was hunting. And that's when she appeared, silent, poised, and marked for judgment. The black Mercedes S-Class emerged from the bend in the road like a specter gliding through smoke. Its paint gleamed under the fading sun like polished obsidian, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong to just anyone. Every line of its design spoke of money, refinement, and power. But what caught Lieutenant Frank Wallace's attention wasn't the car. It was the woman behind the wheel. She was black, mid-40s, dressed in a deep navy suit tailored with absolute precision. Her hair was swept back into a sleek bun, face framed by sharp cheekbones and a calm, collected expression. Her gaze never flickered toward the patrol car. She didn't brake, didn't hesitate. She simply drove. She wasn't arrogant. She was confident. And that confidence was exactly what made Frank's knuckles tighten around the steering wheel. To a man like him, authority worn by a woman like her was a challenge, not a coincidence. His tone dropped low, bitter and sharp like rusted metal. Mercedes like that, he muttered, not taking his eyes off the car. Woman like her, it never adds up. Trust me. His words weren't about suspicion. They were a verdict, already passed. Bet it's leased, probably paid for by someone else, or stolen. It wasn't just profiling, it was poison he'd practiced. Daniel turned his head, glancing at Frank with a flicker of unease. She didn't break any laws, Lieutenant, he said, careful but firm. So what? Frank growled. She's trying too hard to look clean. That's always a sign. The rookie looked back out the window, trying to shake the chill crawling down his spine. The woman hadn't done anything wrong, but Frank didn't see a citizen. He saw a target wrapped in elegance, and that was all the reason he needed. And just like that, judgment turned into action, with no law broken, no warning given. The siren remained silent, but the red and blue lights began to pulse against the back of the sleek Mercedes like a silent alarm. It was the kind of stop that didn't announce danger. It created it. Jasmine Crockett noticed the lights in her rearview mirror and responded with the ease of someone who'd done this before. She didn't slam on the brakes, didn't swerve. She eased to the curb with quiet precision, flipped on her signal, and coasted into a perfect park alongside the sidewalk. Her hands stayed at 10 and 2, her movements fluid and controlled, like she'd memorized this performance. Not for safety, but for survival. Inside the patrol car, Daniel's forehead creased. She didn't do anything, he said quietly, almost to himself. Frank gave a dry laugh, low and mean. They never do, until they do, he muttered, throwing the cruiser into park. Trouble always smells the same. He opened his door and stepped out, already walking like he owned the outcome. Daniel hesitated for half a second before following, unease crawling under his skin like static. As they approached, Jasmine lowered her window halfway, posture steady. No fear in her eyes, just practiced calm, like someone who knew that fear could be misread, used against her. Good evening, officer, she said evenly. Is there a reason I was pulled over? Her voice was soft, but there was steel in it, a quiet resistance woven through every syllable. Frank didn't answer the question. He just stared at her for a beat too long before snapping, License and registration. Jasmine nodded once, saying nothing, and reached, slowly, deliberately, for the glove compartment. She moved like a surgeon, every gesture visible, every choice calculated. Her license, registration, and insurance were all handed over together, neat and current. Daniel took mental note. There were no violations, no signs of impairment, no cause. And yet the temperature between them dropped. Frank flipped through her documents with exaggerated scrutiny, eyebrows raised, lip curled. "Nice car," he said flatly. "You rent it, or someone let you borrow it?" Jasmine blinked once, still holding his gaze. "It's mine," she replied, tone even. "I bought it last year." Frank snorted. "Right. You live around here?" Jasmine hesitated a breath, not from guilt, but from recognition. She knew where this was going. "I don't see how that's relevant, officer," she replied, voice tight. Frank leaned in, his face inches from hers, shadow spilling into the car. "I'll decide what's relevant. Answer the question." Behind him, Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing around. Cars passed, pedestrians glanced but didn't stop. No one interfered. And then, the moment turned, subtle tensions snapped into open aggression. Frank's voice, already laced with hostility, hardened into a command that brooked no discussion. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, louder now, every syllable punctuated with force. He wasn't asking. He wasn't explaining. He was asserting control, because to him, authority didn't need reason, only compliance. Jasmine blinked slowly, steadying herself, eyes still fixed on him. "Officer," she said evenly, "I've complied fully. I've broken no laws. Am I under arrest?" Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the surface. Not fear, but defiance born of experience. Frank didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his shadow falling across her lap like a curtain closing on dignity. His fingers brushed against the butt of his sidearm, not drawing it, but letting her see that he could. Jasmine glanced at the gesture, then looked back at him with deliberate slowness, unblinking. "I'm not resisting," she added, "but I will not be treated like a threat without cause." Daniel shifted on his feet behind them, tension buzzing in his chest like an electric wire about to snap. With a dramatic sigh, Jasmine reached across her body, unbuckled her seatbelt, and opened the car door. Her movements were precise, practiced, the choreography of someone who knew that any sudden motion could be twisted into a justification for violence. She stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the asphalt, and stood tall, her presence commanding even in the face of humiliation. But Frank wasn't finished. Without asking, without even a pause, he reached into the car and grabbed her handbag from the passenger seat. "What's in here, huh?" he snapped, already digging into it. Jasmine's expression changed, but she didn't flinch. "You do not have my consent to search my belongings," she said, voice low and cutting. "That's a violation of my rights." Frank didn't respond. He ripped open the flap and violently dumped the contents onto the hood of her car. Her phone bounced once before landing face down. A slim notepad slid across the metal and nearly fell to the pavement. A small gold pen, a lipstick tube, and a leather wallet scattered like debris from a wreck. Daniel stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion car crash. None of this was standard. None of it was legal. But the worst part wasn't the silence. It was the normalcy in how Frank moved, how easily he turned a routine stop into a spectacle. Jasmine, still composed, stepped forward and began calmly gathering her belongings. "There is nothing suspicious here. There never was," she said, each word precise like a courtroom statement. But Frank stepped closer, towering over her, voice lowered to a growl. "People like you always have something to hide," he hissed. It wasn't policing. It was personal. It was power used like a weapon. And Jasmine, standing firm in the middle of the street, knew exactly what she was up against. Not just one man, but a system that gave him permission to believe she didn't belong. And just when it seemed the humiliation was over, Frank crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The last item Jasmine retrieved from the hood of her car, a slim leather notepad, was still in her hand when Frank turned his back to her and walked toward the open driver's side door. His steps weren't rushed, but they weren't routine either. They carried the practiced ease of a man who'd done this before and never been questioned. Daniel noticed it immediately. The unnatural calm, the tight movement of Frank's right shoulder as he slipped one hand inside his jacket. Daniel's training told him to observe the small things, the gestures that reveal intent when words don't. And this was wrong. Too deliberate, too rehearsed. Frank's hand emerged holding something small, semi-transparent, reflective. A plastic bag. It was sealed tight, folded, controlled. Daniel's eyes locked on it. It hadn't come from Jasmine. It hadn't fallen from her purse. It hadn't been on the hood, the seat, or the ground. Frank had it on him. And now, like a magician preparing the final step of a trick, Frank leaned into the car with a subtle dip of the shoulder, gone for barely 2 seconds. When he stood up again, the bag was gone. Daniel's heart stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The world didn't blur or spin, it just fell silent, as if the street itself was holding its breath. Frank dusted off his vest like nothing had happened. His face morphed into a picture of manufactured surprise. He raised his voice with the smooth confidence of a man who'd done this dance before. "Well, well," he said, drawing out the words like a showman unveiling a final act. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little situation." His tone was laced with false concern, but Daniel could hear it for what it was, a script. Frank dipped back into the car again, this time making a show of it. "What do we have here?" he said louder, his voice meant to carry. Then he emerged, holding the plastic bag like it had appeared from thin air, pinched delicately between 2 fingers. The contents were unmistakable. A white powder, neatly packed, the kind used too often in headlines to destroy lives. Daniel's stomach turned. He felt bile rising in his throat, but he didn't move. Couldn't. All around them, the sidewalk had shifted. Phones were out. Eyes were watching. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, just loud enough to register. Jasmine stood frozen, her back straight, her eyes locked on Frank. But she wasn't confused. She wasn't surprised. She was tired. And underneath the calm on her face was something deeper, something carved from years of seeing this play out, of watching good men say nothing while bad ones rewrote reality in real time. She had seen this before. Too many had. This wasn't about law. This wasn't about drugs. This was about power, about the story Frank wanted to tell, and how easily he could tell it. Jasmine took one step forward. Her voice rang clear, slicing through the growing crowd like a razor. "That's not mine," she said, loud enough for the phones, the bystanders, the world. There was no panic in her tone, no desperation, just a steady, defiant truth. "You planted that." Frank didn't miss a beat. He gave a dry laugh, sarcastic and loud enough to cover the weight of her words. "Sure, lady," he said with a smirk. "That's what they all say." Then slowly he turned toward Daniel, his partner, his junior, his shield. His eyes narrowed just slightly. He raised his brows as if asking, "You've got my back, right?" The unspoken pressure between them was suffocating, but Daniel didn't respond. His mouth felt dry. His thoughts raced. He had seen everything, clearly, unmistakably. Frank had pulled the bag from his own jacket. It didn't matter what the crowd believed. It didn't matter what Jasmine said or how composed she remained. He knew the truth. And now he stood on the edge of a decision that would define not just this moment, but his entire life. Speak up and risk everything. Stay silent and become complicit in a lie that would break an innocent woman's life. The air felt thick. The lights still flashed. Frank turned back to the crowd, holding the bag higher. "Under the seat," he said confidently. "Clear as day." Another one who thought she was untouchable. His words landed like a gavel, but Daniel knew it was a lie dressed in uniform. His fingers clenched at his sides, his body locked between 2 forces, truth and fear. Then Jasmine looked at him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move toward him, but her eyes locked on his with quiet force, like they could pin him to the pavement. She didn't blink. She just stared, into him, through him. Her voice dropped low enough that only he could hear. "You saw it." It wasn't a question. It was the kind of truth that couldn't be unspoken. Her gaze didn't flinch. Her jaw was tight, but her voice stayed steady, deliberate. "And now you have to decide. Will you let this happen? Will you stay silent? She didn't need to beg. She didn't plead for justice. She just held him accountable. And that was worse, because she knew what this was. She knew how it could end. But she wasn't going to carry his silence for him. Daniel felt his chest tighten, the pressure in his ribcage building like a dam about to break. His training, his loyalty, his fear, his future. They all crashed into each other at once. Jasmine hadn't taken a step back. She stood her ground with dignity. Even now, after being humiliated, accused, and framed, she held more grace than the man who'd orchestrated the whole thing. Daniel looked at Frank, still playing to the crowd, still pretending he'd uncovered something, still selling the lie. And then, without hesitation, Frank escalated the lie into spectacle. He turned to face the growing crowd, holding the plastic bag aloft like it was some kind of twisted trophy. The glare of the setting sun caught the bag just right, white powder glittering faintly under the fading light, making it look more dramatic, more incriminating. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank called out, his voice rising above the quiet hum of murmurs and phone cameras clicking on. "Looks like we've got ourselves a felony narcotic situation here." His tone was loud, smug, and performative. The crowd shifted instantly. Some gasped, others exchanged glances. A few people stepped closer, phones raised, eyes wide. The words drugs and black woman had just been strung together in public by a uniformed officer, and that combination carried a weight older than any law book. Jasmine stood still, shoulders squared, watching it unfold like a movie she'd been forced to watch too many times before. She didn't move, didn't plead, because this wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. This was about narrative, and Frank had seized control of it. He turned back toward her with mock disappointment layered over thinly veiled triumph. "You should have just come clean," he said loudly, voice made for the cameras. "Would have saved us all some time." The crowd responded like a live studio audience, some shaking their heads, others whispering too loudly to be private. One woman muttered, "Knew something was off the second I saw that car." A man nearby said, "They always act innocent till they're caught." Phones kept recording, feeding the lie to the algorithm. Jasmine's eyes didn't leave Frank's face. Not once. But behind her stillness was a storm. She was watching every move, every gesture, burning it into memory. She didn't flinch, even when Frank stepped closer, still clutching the bag. His voice lowered slightly, meant only for her this time. "This'll stick," he said. "Doesn't matter who you are." Jasmine's gaze hardened. Her chin lifted just slightly, the only sign of resistance she allowed herself in that moment. And still, she didn't blink, because she knew his performance wasn't just for the crowd, it was to break her, publicly, permanently. But just as Frank tried to deliver the final blow, Jasmine struck back, with truth sharper than any accusation. She didn't flinch. She didn't shout. While the crowd murmured and the phones captured their digital verdicts, Jasmine slowly, deliberately reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. Her movements were precise, not hesitant, but intentional, calm like the eye of a storm. Daniel instinctively took a half step forward, unsure of what was happening, but Jasmine remained composed, her every motion radiating control. Frank's eyes narrowed, one hand inching toward his holster, mistaking her poise for threat. But Jasmine moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She pulled out a slim, dark leather badge wallet, nothing flashy, but stamped with a golden seal that caught the light like a spark in dry grass. With a single flick of her thumb, she opened it, holding it up at chest level so that both Frank and every camera phone could see clearly. And then, with a voice steady enough to silence the wind, she said the words that detonated the moment. "My name is Jasmine Crockett," she declared, locking eyes with Frank. "Senior advisor to the President of the United States." Frank didn't move. His body was rigid, his eyes locked onto that golden presidential seal like it was something radioactive. The smug confidence that had carried him moments earlier drained from his face, leaving only a pale, brittle man standing in the center of a lie too big to outrun. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came, not even a breath of denial. He had nothing, nothing that could explain away what he had just done. The uniform no longer looked like protection. It looked like a costume, a mask torn off too late. Daniel stood a foot behind him, his mind still trying to keep up with what his eyes had already accepted. The mentor he thought he respected had committed a felony, and not against a stranger, but against a woman of integrity, power, and restraint. Someone who had done everything right and still ended up targeted because of what she looked like, not what she did. Then the crowd cracked open. People shouted, pointed, cried out in disbelief. "He framed her," someone screamed. "That's a federal official," another gasped. Phones lifted higher, the whispers turned to outrage, and the outrage turned to noise. And amid the chaos, Jasmine's voice sliced through like the ring of a gavel. "Officer Daniel," she said, her tone unwavering, her gaze locked onto him with unshakable precision. "You saw what happened. Tell the truth." It wasn't loud, it wasn't desperate, but it carried more weight than anything else Daniel had ever heard in his life. It wasn't just a call for justice, it was a call for courage. She wasn't begging him to save her. She was demanding that he save himself. From the lie, from complicity, from the cowardice that grows when good people stand still. Daniel's heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out the crowd. His mind split between two futures. One where he stayed silent, kept his job, earned Frank's approval, and hated himself forever. Or one where he spoke, risked everything, and finally lived up to the badge on his chest. He could feel Frank's eyes burning into the side of his face. That silent threat. You speak, you're finished. That look that every rookie feared. But Jasmine was still watching. She didn't blink. She didn't break. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel realized neither would he. He took a breath. It wasn't steady. His hands trembled. His voice cracked on the first word. But he didn't stop. "Lieutenant Wallace," he began, the words falling from his lips like bricks, each one heavier than the last. I saw him take the bag from his jacket." Gasps. The crowd went dead silent. "He bent into the car and placed it under the seat. It didn't come from her bag. It didn't come from the car." He looked up, eyes darting between Jasmine and the crowd. "It wasn't hers." Frank took a half step forward. "You don't know what you're saying," he growled. But Daniel didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Daniel cut in, louder now, stronger. "And so do you. You tried to frame her." The crowd erupted again. A woman sobbed. A man shouted, "You're done, Wallace." A dozen cameras zoomed in. Others called out in support of Daniel, their shock now layered with something deeper. Relief. Relief that someone had finally spoken the truth out loud. Frank's face twisted with rage, but his posture faltered. He looked at Daniel like he couldn't believe the betrayal, but it wasn't betrayal. It was integrity, finally refusing to look away. Jasmine's expression softened, not with gratitude, but with solemn respect. She nodded once, slow and purposeful. She had known this moment would come. She just didn't know who would be brave enough to carry it. And Daniel, he had never felt more terrified, or more free. Because the worst part wasn't what Frank had done, it was how close Daniel had come to letting it happen. But not anymore. Not now, not in front of her, not in front of the crowd, and not in front of himself. And as Daniel's voice sliced through the silence, the final wall of denial collapsed. The truth was no longer a murmur. It was a thunderclap, echoing in the eyes of the crowd, vibrating through every phone still held high. Jasmine stood tall, unmoved by the storm around her. But inside, she understood the fragility of moments like this. Truth didn't change systems overnight, but accountability, spoken out loud and witnessed by many, was a fire that couldn't be put out once it started. She turned fully toward Frank. The man who minutes ago tried to humiliate her now stood exposed, his lie crumbling under its own weight. His jaw clenched, eyes darting between Jasmine and Daniel, looking for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing left, no policy to cite, no excuse that wouldn't sound like the desperate flailing of a man who had finally run out of room to hide. "Lieutenant Wallace," Jasmine said, her voice clear, unwavering, and loud enough for the entire street to hear. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately." The words landed like a gavel slamming against granite. The crowd gasped. Some cheered. Others fell silent in awe. Frank blinked, frozen for half a second, as if he hadn't fully processed what she said. Then his body tensed, and the anger poured through his voice like oil igniting. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed," he barked, stepping forward, eyes blazing. "I've kept this city safe. I've done what had to be done to keep order." His face flushed, veins bulging in his neck as he reached to rip the badge from his chest, gripping it so tightly his knuckles went white. "You think you're going to stand here and judge me? I've worn this badge since before you knew how to tie a tie." Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She took a slow, controlled step forward, closing the space between them until there was no mistaking who was in control now. "There is no order in planting evidence," she said coldly, voice like glass slicing through flesh. "There is no protection in targeting the innocent. You didn't keep the city safe today, Lieutenant. You poisoned it." Her words cut deeper than any weapon. Frank opened his mouth again, but she raised her hand, not to silence him, but to end it. "Hand over your firearm and badge," she ordered, "right now." There was no shouting, no struggle, just the weight of truth pressing down on Frank's shoulders like a mountain. He looked around and realized no one was stepping in for him. Not this time. Not after what they'd all seen. Slowly, almost as if it pained him more than any injury ever had, he reached to unclip his sidearm. The metal groaned in its holster as he passed it over, followed by the badge he once wore like armor. Now it felt like an indictment. Jasmine accepted both items with steady hands. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk. There was no victory in this moment, only gravity. "You chose fear over fairness," she said softly, but with weight that settled over the crowd. "Power without principle is a weapon, and today you used it like one." Frank stood there, breathing heavily, red-faced and deflated. The man who thought he was untouchable was now nothing more than a cautionary tale standing in full view of a community he was supposed to serve. And the community was watching, not just him, but everything. How he responded, how Jasmine carried herself, how Daniel, trembling but resolved, had chosen truth. And above it all, there was Jasmine, still, steady, resolute, not just defending herself, but sending a message to everyone watching. This is what accountability looks like. This is what justice sounds like. And as Daniel's words echoed through the street, the weight of the truth shifted. Now it was time for consequences. Jasmine stepped forward, her expression carved from stone, her presence radiating authority like the eye of a storm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Every camera was on her. Every breath of the crowd seemed to pause, waiting for what would come next. She faced Frank head-on, her tone sharp, precise, and unmistakably final. "Lieutenant Wallace," she said, voice unwavering, "you are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately." Gasps spread like fire through the crowd. "Hand over your weapon and badge." Her words weren't a request. They were an execution of accountability. For a moment, Frank didn't move. The silence stretched too long. Then his face contorted, first with confusion, then outrage. "You can't do this," he snapped, fists clenched at his sides, voice rising like a man realizing the walls were finally closing in. "I've served this city for 20 damn years. I've kept these streets clean." He yanked his badge from his chest and held it up like a trophy, voice trembling with rage. "Everything I did was to maintain order." Jasmine's eyes narrowed. She took one step closer, unflinching, calm in the face of his unraveling. "There is no order," she said, her voice like cold steel, "built on lies and prejudice." The crowd murmured, some in stunned silence, others cheering softly. Frank's shoulders rose as if preparing to fight, but there was no fight left to win. Jasmine didn't back down. "You didn't protect anyone today," she continued. "You tried to destroy a life, and you did it with a smile. That's not service. That's power abused." Her words weren't just meant for Frank. They were for every officer watching, for every phone recording, for every citizen who had ever wondered if speaking out would matter. And in that moment, it did. And as Frank finally stepped back, disarmed, disgraced, and dismissed, the crowd stood in stunned silence, waiting for someone to make sense of what they just witnessed. The flashing lights of new patrol cars reflected off windshields and windows, but no siren could drown the magnitude of this moment. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all, her poise unshaken, her voice needed. Officers arrived on scene, but none dared interrupt her. They knew this wasn't just a police matter anymore. It had become national. Journalists pushed forward, microphones outstretched, cameras rolling, questions fired like bullets. "Ma'am, what's your official response? Do you intend to press charges? Is the White House aware of the incident?" Jasmine took a breath, then stepped up to one of the microphones, brushing a lock of hair from her face with the same hand that had held her badge minutes earlier. Her voice, when it came, was not cold, not defensive. It was human, deeply grounded, measured, but there was steel beneath it. "Today," she began, "I did not act as a senior advisor to the President of the United States." Her eyes scanned the crowd, camera lights reflecting off her pupils like fire. "Today, I acted as a private citizen, a woman, a Black American, and a person who demanded nothing more than to be treated fairly under the law." Gasps and murmurs passed through the audience, not of shock, but of resonance. Her words weren't just truth. They were a reflection of so many unheard voices. She continued, her tone never wavering. "I wasn't speeding. I didn't run a light. I complied. I showed my hands. I answered questions. And still I was stopped, humiliated, and accused. Because of how I looked, not what I did. That should terrify every American who believes in justice." Behind her, Daniel Tran stood in silence. But his silence now carried weight, not fear. His eyes, once heavy with doubt, now held clarity. There was something in the way he looked at Jasmine, like he was seeing the job for the first time through the right lens. He'd worn the badge. Now he understood what it meant to earn it. Jasmine turned slightly toward him, offering a subtle but powerful nod. Then she faced the cameras again, this time her words coming from somewhere deeper, not from her title, but from her lived experience. "Today, a police officer tried to plant evidence on me. He abused his badge, his authority, and the trust this country placed in him. And had there been no cameras, no witnesses, no brave officer willing to tell the truth, I might have been just another headline." She paused. The crowd was silent. Even the wind seemed to stop to listen. But this didn't happen in the shadows. It happened on record, on camera, in public. So now we have a choice. Will we look away, or will we face it and fix it? The silence shattered into applause, not the polite, hesitant kind. This was thunderous, raw, earned. Some in the crowd wiped tears, others raised fists. Many simply clapped until their hands turned red. They weren't just applauding a speech, they were applauding courage, truth, and the fact that, for once, someone stood their ground and didn't flinch. Daniel felt the knot in his chest loosen, just a bit. His fingers unclenched, his pulse slowed. For months he had walked a line between the ideals of the academy and the realities of the street. But today he had crossed that line and stepped into integrity. He looked down at the badge pinned to his chest. For the first time, it didn't feel like something he was borrowing. It felt like something he had finally earned. As Jasmine stepped away from the microphones, a young reporter near the front turned to the camera with urgency. "Breaking now in Lexington, Kentucky," she said, voice tight with emotion. "A senior White House official has just been cleared of false drug charges after a junior officer exposed a fellow cop for planting evidence." The story's already trending nationwide, with civil rights groups calling for swift prosecution and reform. The footage began streaming across platforms in real time. Clips of Jasmine's words were shared, reposted, stitched, subtitled. Her face, calm, composed, powerful, filled screens across the country. The message wasn't just about her, it was about the millions who saw themselves in her. The mothers, fathers, children, veterans, professionals, anyone who'd ever been stopped, questioned, or profiled for no reason at all. Within an hour, hashtags flooded social media. Number I stand with Jasmine, number justice in Lexington, number badge and truth. From the corner of the sidewalk, a young girl held her phone to her chest and whispered to her mother, "She's like a superhero." Her mother nodded slowly, eyes still glistening with emotion. "No," she said, "she's something harder. She's real. And Jasmine? She didn't bask in it. She didn't pose. She turned to Daniel, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. You did the right thing, she said. That's where change begins, one truth at a time. He nodded, eyes glassy but steady. I almost didn't, he admitted. But you did, she replied. And that's what matters. They stood side by side, not as hero and witness, not as official and officer, but as equals in the face of a broken system, choosing not to be broken by it. And somewhere, deep beneath the concrete of Lexington streets, the seeds of something new had just been planted. Not because power had spoken, but because power had been held accountable by truth, by courage, and by the refusal to back down. And as Jasmine and Daniel disappeared into the backdrop of sirens and applause, the ripple they had created became a tidal wave. It began with a single clip. 30 seconds of cell phone footage uploaded by a bystander named Alicia Vega. No captions, no edits. Just raw, unfiltered truth. Jasmine Crockett, standing tall, voice calm, revealing her identity to a disbelieving world. Within minutes, the video passed 1 million views. By the first hour, it was climbing into trending territory. But that was only the beginning. Footage from 5, 10, 20 different angles began surfacing, each showing new layers of the confrontation. Daniel's trembling voice as he stepped forward. Frank's face contorted in denial. The moment Jasmine said, I'm not here as an advisor, I'm here as a citizen. It was more than a soundbite. It was a statement carved in stone. Local news stations cut into scheduled programming. Lexington's WKYT aired an emergency panel with legal experts dissecting the possible charges facing Frank Wallace. By 8 p.m. Eastern, national media had descended like vultures and protectors all at once. CNN branded the footage one of the clearest, most public displays of police corruption in recent memory. MSNBC called it a moment of moral clarity. Meanwhile, social media erupted. On Twitter, #Y Stand with Jasmine held the top trending spot in under 2 hours, followed by #Daniel Did Right and #Lexington Truth. On Instagram, activists, lawyers, and celebrities began reposting Jasmine's calm face, her badge in one hand, the microphone in the other. Millions were moved, not just by what happened, but by the way Jasmine held herself under fire, like a lighthouse standing firm in a storm designed to sink her. TikTok took it to another level. Creators added voiceovers, explained the law behind what happened, created timelines, recreated the scene, praised Daniel's courage and Jasmine's restraint. One creator dubbed it the moment that cracked the silence. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own stories. This happened to my brother, but no one believed him. I was stopped, searched, and no one had a camera. She's speaking for all of us. The collective outcry wasn't chaotic. It was focused, fierce, fueled by clarity, and the public wasn't asking for awareness anymore. They were demanding consequences. Back in D.C., the White House could no longer afford silence. Just after 9:15 p.m., the official White House press pool received an internal statement marked priority. By 9:42, reporters filled the Brady briefing room. Cameras flashed. A hush fell as the press secretary walked to the podium, papers in hand, face set in measured gravity. She looked out across the sea of lenses, then spoke. Good evening. Tonight, the president has been made fully aware of the incident involving senior advisor Jasmine Crockett and the Lexington Police Department. She paused, letting the words settle. We want to be crystal clear. This administration does not tolerate the misuse of power, racial profiling, or the betrayal of public trust. Not in Lexington, not anywhere. There was no defensiveness, no vague generalities, only precise accountability. Ms. Crockett's role within the administration is irrelevant in this context. She could have been anyone, any citizen, and what happened would still be unacceptable. But the fact that she is a federal advisor, stopped, searched, and falsely accused in full public view only underlines what many Americans have long known, but rarely seen acknowledged in this way. The room remained silent. No interruptions, no grandstanding. For once, the message wasn't political, it was human. The president has instructed the Department of Justice to launch a formal, independent investigation. The FBI has been notified. Transparency will be total. We owe that not just to Ms. Crockett, but to every American who's ever wondered if they'd be believed when the system failed them. A beat passed before the press secretary added one final line, unwritten, off script. Tonight, we are not just addressing an incident, we are confronting a wound. It was the soundbite that would lead every news broadcast from coast to coast, and while the White House statement rippled across airwaves, it was the Department of Justice that delivered the first real thunderclap. Within hours of the press briefing, unmarked black SUVs rolled into Lexington. Federal agents from the Civil Rights Division and Internal Affairs Task Force began coordinating with state prosecutors. This wasn't a courtesy visit. It was a full-blown, no-holds-barred inquiry. What had once been a local scandal had officially become a federal matter, with national eyes locked on every step. The focus, initially centered on Lieutenant Frank Wallace, widened quickly. Investigators requested decades of internal misconduct files, HR records, and complaint logs from the Lexington Police Department. And what they found was damning. More than 24 complaints had been filed against Wallace over the last 10 years. None had ever resulted in disciplinary action. Not one. His name appeared repeatedly in use of force reports, questionable traffic stops, and missing body cam footage logs. And it didn't stop with him. Federal analysts connected a troubling pattern within the entire unit Wallace operated in, an elite patrol group informally known as Echo Sector. Among them were officers with spotless external records, but suspiciously consistent internal complaints, all quietly dismissed by supervisors who now found themselves under investigation as well. One federal investigator was overheard saying, "We're not just dealing with a few bad apples. This is a poisoned orchard with a forged inspection report." Subpoenas were issued. Former officers, some retired, some pushed out, began to speak. One whistleblower described a culture of organized silence, where officers were trained not just in firearms and tactics, but in how to write reports that could survive legal scrutiny, even when the truth had to be bent to fit. Files long thought shredded or buried began resurfacing. An old civil case from 2017, previously thrown out due to lack of evidence, was reopened. It became clear Jasmine's case had blown the lock off a vault full of ghosts. Meanwhile, Lexington itself was being rewritten in real time. Within days, the city transformed into a civic pressure cooker. Town hall meetings, once sparsely attended, were now overflowing. People stood in the aisles, waited outside, watched on mobile phones through cracked windows. Local churches opened their doors to organize community strategy sessions. Civic groups printed flyers titled "We Knew." Now what? Community organizers didn't just demand accountability. They laid out blueprints. They weren't burning down the system. They were redesigning it, brick by brick. State senators and city council members who had once cautiously tiptoed around the subject of police reform now stood at podiums, openly backing civilian oversight boards, body cam mandates, and independent review panels. A former judge called for a full forensic audit of Lexington PD's last 15 years. A group of local teachers created a program for students to learn their rights during police encounters, funded not by the state, but by grassroots donations. And under every podium, every chant, every press release was the same truth. This change only started because one woman refused to stay silent. But the center of that movement, Jasmine Crockett, refused to step away from the fire. In the days that followed the incident, advisors in Washington urged her to return. Her legal team recommended rest. Her inner circle, worried about her safety, proposed protective relocation until things cooled down. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood in front of the Lexington City Courthouse, wearing the same navy blue suit she'd worn during the stop, and addressed the public again. "I've been offered a plane ticket and a press-safe recovery period," she said, her voice steady, amplified by only a single handheld mic. "But I don't need a break. I need the city to know that I'm not leaving." She paused. The crowd held its breath. Cameras rolled. You can't rebuild trust from a distance. You rebuild it from where it was broken. You show up. You listen. You stand in the rubble with the people who were expected to just live in it. "I didn't come to Lexington to survive a scandal. I came to stay until it's better." Applause erupted. louder than before, no longer just supportive, but transformational. It wasn't admiration anymore. It was alignment. That same day, Jasmine met with the acting police chief behind closed doors. What was scheduled as a 20-minute courtesy conversation stretched to nearly 2 hours. Reports later confirmed she requested direct access to training program materials, internal discipline records, and oversight mechanisms. One source said she opened the meeting by saying, "I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here to fix what you lost sight of." Jasmine worked nonstop. No motorcade, no entourage, just quiet determination. She visited schools. She sat in community centers with grieving parents who had lost children to silence. She attended roll call meetings at precincts where young officers avoided eye contact, unsure whether to salute her or fear her. She held space for them all. "I'm not anti-police," she told one room full of young cadets, "but I am anti-corruption, and if that offends you, check your reflection, not your badge." Across the country, people were watching, not just the investigation, but her response to it. She didn't lash out. She didn't politicize. She didn't weaponize the moment. She channeled it into something dangerous to every broken system, accountability with a face and a voice. And in that quiet resistance, she was doing something no federal investigator could mandate. No speechwriter could script. She was making justice feel possible again. One precinct, one truth, one city at a time. And as Frank finally stepped back, disarmed, disgraced, and dismissed, the crowd stood in stunned silence, waiting for someone to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. The flashing lights of new patrol cars reflected off windshields and windows, but no siren could drown the magnitude of this moment. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all, her poise unshaken, her voice needed. Officers arrived on scene, but none dared interrupt her. They knew this wasn't just a police matter anymore. It had become national. Journalists pushed forward, microphones outstretched, cameras rolling, questions fired like bullets. "Ma'am, what's your official response? Do you intend to press charges? Is the White House aware of the incident?" Jasmine took a breath, then stepped up to one of the microphones, brushing a lock of hair from her face with the same hand that had held her badge minutes earlier. Her voice when it came was not cold, not defensive. It was human, deeply grounded, measured, but there was steel beneath it. "Today," she began, "I did not act as a senior advisor to the President of the United States." Her eyes scanned the crowd, camera lights reflecting off her pupils like fire. "Today, I acted as a private citizen, a woman, a Black American, and a person who demanded nothing more than to be treated fairly under the law." Gasps and murmurs passed through the audience, not of shock, but of resonance. Her words weren't just truth. They were a reflection of so many unheard voices. She continued, her tone never wavering. "I wasn't speeding. I didn't run a light. I complied. I showed my hands. I answered questions. And still, I was stopped, humiliated, and accused because of how I looked, not what I did. That should terrify every American who believes in justice." Behind her, Daniel Tran stood in silence. But his silence now carried weight, not fear. His eyes, once heavy with doubt, now held clarity. There was something in the way he looked at Jasmine, like he was seeing the job for the first time through the right lens. He'd worn the badge. Now he understood what it meant to earn it. Jasmine turned slightly toward him, offering a subtle but powerful nod. Then she faced the cameras again, this time her words coming from somewhere deeper, not from her title, but from her lived experience. "Today, a police officer tried to plant evidence on me. He abused his badge, his authority, and the trust this country placed in him. And had there been no cameras, no witnesses, no brave officer willing to tell the truth, I might have been just another headline." She paused. The crowd was silent. Even the wind seemed to stop to listen. But this didn't happen in the shadows. It happened on record, on camera, in public. So now we have a choice. Will we look away, or will we face it and fix it? The silence shattered into applause. Not the polite, hesitant kind. This was thunderous, raw, earned. Some in the crowd wiped tears. Others raised fists. Many simply clapped until their hands turned red. They weren't just applauding a speech. They were applauding courage, truth, and the fact that, for once, someone stood their ground and didn't flinch. Daniel felt the knot in his chest loosen, just a bit, his fingers unclenched. His pulse slowed. For months, he had walked a line between the ideals of the academy and the realities of the street. But today, he had crossed that line and stepped into integrity. He looked down at the badge pinned to his chest. For the first time, it didn't feel like something he was borrowing. It felt like something he had finally earned. As Jasmine stepped away from the microphones, a young reporter near the front turned to the camera with urgency. "Breaking now in Lexington, Kentucky," she said, voice tight with emotion. "A senior White House official has just been cleared of false drug charges after a junior officer exposed a fellow cop for planting evidence. The story is already trending nationwide, with civil rights groups calling for swift prosecution and reform." The footage began streaming across platforms in real time. Clips of Jasmine's words were shared, reposted, stitched, subtitled. Her face, calm, composed, powerful, filled screens across the country. The message wasn't just about her. It was about the millions who saw themselves in her. The mothers, fathers, children, veterans, professionals, anyone who'd ever been stopped, questioned, or profiled for no reason at all. Within an hour, hashtags flooded social media. Number I stand with Jasmine, number justice. In Lexington, number badge and truth. From the corner of the sidewalk, a young girl held her phone to her chest and whispered to her mother, "She's like a superhero." Her mother nodded slowly, eyes still glistening with emotion. "No," she said. "She's something harder. She's real." And Jasmine? She didn't bask in it. She didn't pose. She turned to Daniel, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said. "That's where change begins, one truth at a time." He nodded, eyes glassy but steady. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "But you did," she replied. "And that's what matters." They stood side by side, not as hero and witness, not as official and officer, but as equals in the face of a broken system, choosing not to be broken by it. And somewhere, deep beneath the concrete of Lexington streets, the seeds of something new had just been planted. Not because power had spoken, but because power had been held accountable. By truth, by courage, and by the refusal to back down. But as national attention grew and Jasmine held the front line, Daniel was summoned to face a quieter, colder battle. One fought not on camera, but behind closed doors. The internal hearing room at precinct headquarters was small, windowless, and deliberately sterile. Daniel sat across from a semicircle of senior officers, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. A long table separated them like a wall. No press, no cameras, just Daniel, a recorder, and the silent weight of expectation pressing down like a ceiling about to crack. One of the captains leaned forward, lacing his fingers. "Officer Tran," he said flatly, "while your actions may have received public praise, there's growing concern about your method." Daniel raised his eyes, unsure where this was going. "You bypassed protocol. You aired department matters to the public. You broke rank. That is not how we handle internal conflict." Another senior officer chimed in, voice sharper, tone bordering on disgust. "What you did out there may have felt righteous, but it set a dangerous precedent. You just lit a match under this entire department." Daniel didn't blink. He leaned forward slowly, voice steady. "If the whole department fears one match of truth, then maybe it needs to burn before it can be rebuilt." The room went silent, not because they were shocked by his words, but because deep down, many of them knew he was right. Still, tension crackled. A third officer, a grizzled sergeant near retirement, muttered under his breath, "This job used to mean something." Daniel replied without missing a beat. "It still can, but not if we keep protecting the lie." When the meeting adjourned, no verdict was given, just cold nods and clipped thank yous. Daniel walked out feeling like he'd been put on a silent watch list. But as he made his way through the locker room, something unexpected happened. A younger officer, barely out of field training, stepped out from behind a row of lockers and said quietly, "We've seen things too. Stuff that didn't sit right. We just didn't know we were allowed to say it out loud." Another rookie nodded. You gave people like us a way forward. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a crack, a fracture, and light was starting to leak through. Outside the building, the air was brisk. Daniel stood for a moment, staring up at the sky. He knew things wouldn't get easier. He'd face retaliation, suspicion, maybe even reassignment. But something inside him felt solid now, grounded. For the first time since pinning on the badge, he wasn't carrying it for others. He was carrying it for himself, and for the people who never had the chance to speak. And in that quiet moment, far from the crowd, he made a promise to himself. This won't be the last truth I speak. And while Daniel stood taller in the shadow of hard-earned truth, Jasmine was just beginning her most public battle yet. Not as a survivor, but as a reformer. Weeks after the Lexington incident, Jasmine was invited to speak at the National Forum on Criminal Justice Reform in Washington, D.C. An invitation extended to her, not as a political appointee, but as a symbol. She stepped onto the stage of the packed convention hall in a simple navy dress, no podium between her and the audience. In front of her were lawmakers, policy advisors, state attorneys general, and hundreds of law enforcement leaders. But Jasmine didn't speak like a politician. She spoke like someone who had bled for the truth. That day in Lexington, she began, I wasn't protected by my badge or my title. I was protected because someone, just one person, had the courage to say, this is wrong. That's what saved me. Not power, not privilege, a decision. The room was still, no coughing, no fidgeting, just breath held in suspense. So I ask you, she continued, voice sharper now, what kind of system do we have if justice relies on chance? What if there hadn't been a camera? What if Daniel hadn't spoken? What if I wasn't Jasmine Crockett? Would I be here today? Or would I be a file gathering dust in some evidence room? By the time she stepped off stage, the room erupted, not in applause but in action. Within days, the Department of Justice confirmed a joint initiative to review outdated training protocols nationwide. Jasmine was offered a seat at the design table. She accepted on one condition: Daniel Tran would join her. Together, they co-founded a task force to create a new training model, the Ethics and Enforcement Curriculum. It was unlike anything ever introduced into federal training programs. Instead of solely focusing on tactics and compliance, their curriculum drilled into character. Bias awareness, moral reasoning under pressure, whistleblower protections, scenario-based simulations, and historical case studies. Every module included real footage, including Jasmine's own stop, as required material. It forced recruits to confront the question, what would you have done? Daniel, still a uniformed officer, stood in front of classes of new cadets and told them about the moment his world split in two. I had to choose between a brotherhood and the truth, he'd say, voice steady. I chose the truth, and I sleep at night because of it. Their model was soon adopted as a pilot program in 7 states, then 12. Within a year, it became the federal standard for all incoming officers under DOJ jurisdiction. Meanwhile, the fallout in Lexington continued to cascade. A sweeping internal audit, triggered by Jasmine's case and sustained by DOJ pressure, exposed years of misconduct buried under red tape. A total of 18 officers, including 2 captains and a former internal affairs director, were either fired, suspended, or placed under federal investigation. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of over 40 citizens whose complaints had been ignored or dismissed. Some cases were reopened. Others resulted in settlements. But more importantly, public trust, once shattered, began to form again. Not through promises, but through action. Jasmine didn't disappear after that. She kept showing up. She attended town halls and community forums. She sat through painful testimonies from families whose loved ones didn't have Daniel standing beside them. She didn't offer comfort. She offered transparency. I can't promise the system won't fail again, she told a grieving mother in one forum. But I can promise we're building a system that's harder to corrupt and easier to fix when it cracks. Her presence wasn't just symbolic, it was stabilizing. And then, in what felt like a full-circle moment, Jasmine and Daniel's story caught the attention of the entertainment world. A team of independent filmmakers, moved by the rawness of what had transpired, pitched a concept to Netflix. Not a dramatization, not a fictionalized version, a documentary told through body cam footage, interviews, courtroom clips, and journal entries. It would be called Under the Badge. The title came from something Jasmine said during a closed-door panel. The badge isn't what protects you, it's what hides them, if we let it. Netflix picked it up immediately. The trailer alone racked up 11 million views in its first 24 hours. It featured Daniel staring down the lens, voice cracking as he said, "I almost stayed quiet. I almost let it happen, but I didn't. And that's the only reason we're telling this story instead of burying it." The film premiered in select cities and was released globally within weeks. It sparked national dialogue. Police academies hosted internal screenings. Churches, universities, and even corporate HR departments streamed it in workshops. The hashtag number sign under the badge flooded timelines, along with photos of people holding up blank ID cards with the caption, "Even if I wasn't someone, I should still be protected." And amid it all, Jasmine kept going. She declined job offers. She turned down book deals. She refused to be turned into a brand. "This isn't a comeback story," she told one interviewer. "This is a system story, and systems take time to fix." From a roadside injustice to a national reckoning, Jasmine Crockett and Daniel Tran became unlikely architects of reform. Not because they were perfect, but because they were willing to bleed for the truth in public when it mattered most. They didn't seek power. They used their pain to reshape it. And as the country watched, something rare happened. People believed again. Not in the system itself, but in the people brave enough to demand it be better. And as the final credits of Under the Badge rolled across millions of screens, the real work, the enduring work, was only just beginning. Months later, at a newly restructured police academy in Louisville, Kentucky, a soft buzz filled the main lecture hall. 40 young cadets dressed in crisp uniforms and stiff collars sat in quiet anticipation. Some were fresh out of college. Others were former military. A few had seen what injustice looked like up close in their own neighborhoods. But all of them shared one thing. They were about to be trained in a system rebuilt from fire and truth. Jasmine stood behind the glass wall overlooking the room, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on them, not with scrutiny, but with hope. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone carried history, both a warning and a promise. These cadets didn't just know her name. They knew her story. They had studied it. They had debated it. They had been shaped by it. And now they were part of the legacy that followed it. Then the classroom door opened. Daniel Tran stepped in quietly, his stride steady, his eyes sharper than ever. Gone was the uncertainty that once shadowed his every move. He carried a slim binder under one arm, its cover stark white. The title printed in bold, no-nonsense type. How We Rebuild Trust. He placed it gently on the lectern and looked up. The room fell silent. "I'm not here to teach you how to follow orders," he said, voice calm but resolute. "I'm here to show you what it takes to stand when you're the only one who sees the line being crossed." He glanced toward the glass wall. Jasmine was still there, watching, nodding once. "And if we get this right," Daniel continued, "you won't need a camera to prove you did the right thing. Your choices will speak for themselves." Outside, the sky shifted from gray to gold. And inside that academy, a new chapter quietly began. One written not in silence, but in truth spoken early, boldly, and without regret. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.